President Lee Jae Myung hosts a press briefing on this Monday to mark his first year at the top office. On Press Perspective today, we cover this conference. Hope your work week is off to a good start. It's Monday, June 8th here in Seoul, and you're watching Press Perspective. I'm Min Sun-hee. Earlier this morning, President Lee Jae Myung held a press conference to share his thoughts on a host of national affairs amid questions from members of the local as well as foreign media. For more, I have Ruy Valdes with Spanish news agency EFE Spain here in the studio. Ruy, welcome.
Thanks for the invitation, Sunny.
I also have Celio Fioretti with French daily Croix. Celio, it's great to have you here.
Glad to be here.
Ruy, let's start with you. The press conference began with the president's review of the first year of his administration. What did he say?
Well, President Lee, of course, said many things. It was a long press conference, but let's start with the opening remarks, where he kind of framed more or less what he thought of the first year and what are the tasks to solve in the future. He started saying that he took this first year as a mission for recovery and normalization. He said there was three major crises this first year: a democratic one that was caused by the insurrection, the imposition of martial law by previous administration. There was a trade and a security crisis related to changing the international order. We could say tariffs or well, also kind of connected with the Middle East thing, but then he even set apart one specific point to say that there was a livelihood crisis related with the Middle East war, talking about more relation to inflation and how does this affect the livelihood of common Koreans. He framed now Korea as an irreplaceable country. He elaborated that now Korea should move from being a country that the world watches to a country the world needs. And he expressed that the perception of world leaders on South Korea has changed, that he has witnessed how now they care a lot about how South Korea handles global topics such as AI, environment, low birth rates. Now it's always a reference, and people are interested on how the country take on these issues. Lastly, he set up 4 goals for the next phase, as he called it. He said he pledged that South Korea will be turned into a super gap industrial powerhouse with growth reaching small companies, regions, and ordinary people. Second, he promised to strengthen South Korea as a global diplomacy and security power. Third, he called for a normal society where rules are respected for unfairness, privilege, stock manipulation, etc. And fourth, he said the government must protect the life, safety, and dignity through stronger systems like finance, welfare, labor, healthcare, and others. So more or less, that's what he opened with.
Right, indeed. And before we delve deeper into the actual press conference itself, Celia, perhaps we can take this opportunity to take a look at the foreign media's general assessment of the Lee Jae Myung administration's handling of state affairs.
Well, so far, after 1 year, the foreign media has been following quite intensively Lee Jae Myung handling of state affairs. I think a few stories that really struck media's attention. First is the Kospi and the whole economy change. We went from the economy kind of slowing down in almost a sort of like a recession, or at least very slowing down. But now Kospi is rising above 8,000 points, which was more than what Lee Jae Myung pledged at first when he was campaigning for the presidency. So all of that and how Korea took place in one of the major economies, one of the highest market capitalized economy in the world, really struck a lot of attention for foreign media, and also the consequences to that. And what's interesting also, that kind of follow-up from the Kospi is the push for AI, which is the growth in AI also what pushed the Kospi so high. And really this push for AI by the government that nominated some special advisors for AI, and really think that science, innovation, technology will be the engine of growth for the future is also quite interesting. And we see also some innovation AI really is now into industry, but also in the daily life of people, and it brings a lot of debate. We've seen recently, in the case of Samsung, for example, they also strike a lot of attention how the government, when faced to a situation of like enormous growth, huge profit by some high-tech company, how to handle this and all the debate that goes around. So that was also very interesting for foreign media to see. And on more traditional also aspect of domestic policies, the housing market, Lee Jae Myung really quickly went into that field, which can be a bit dangerous for politicians because it's really a sensitive topic, housing market here in Korea. But he really pushed for reform, and he said there will be more to come. But that's also what really foreign media got a lot of attention on. And finally, as my colleague Ruy mentioned, this year was also a year for Lee Jae Myung to recover the political landscape of Korea. And on that, all this reform and scrutiny and being careful to have a more healthy political debate, more healthy political life in Korea, that was also received quite a lot of attention from foreign media.
Right, with regard to domestic affairs, of course. Ruy, what has been highlighted within the foreign media then as some of the gains of the Lee Jae Myung administration on the diplomatic front?
In the diplomatic front, basically what foreign media is saying that his approach of pragmatic diplomacy has been working, at least in most cases. When we talk about China, US, or Japan, yeah, President Lee has proven that he's able to manage these forces that sometimes they contradict each other or they even have direct problems with South Korea and bring them either to South Korea or visit their countries, and it seems to be in a friendly way, signing different pacts, etc. The most complex one, of course, has been the relationship with the US. In general, what is being said is, well, considering the circumstances, the administration of President Lee has, well, somehow navigated the challenges of the Trump administration, of course, highlighting this $350 billion investment pact in the U.S. That South Korea pledged in exchange of reducing the tariffs. At that time, it was a very strong push to solve that issue, and they got to this solution. Of course, again, as we always say in the show, with Trump administration, it's very unpredictable. Now there has been talk again on tariffs. Apparently, U.S. is going to respect the previous agreement, but it's always very unstable. But so far, we can call it that with the U.S., they have navigated. Of course, there's also other tension that maybe we can talk about later related to security and the military presence of U.S. in South Korea. But yeah, more or less, that's what it is. And in terms of China, the relation with China was kind of, we wouldn't say totally frayed, but yeah, there was some kind of strain before he took on power, and he managed to improve this relationship. There was consecutive summits. President Xi Jinping came to China, President Lee as well, and they have been committing to opening more China, for example, to cultural contents of South Korea. There seemed to be some initiative in areas that were blocked before. One of the most clear achievements is regarding Japan. The summits that President Lee has sustained with Prime Minister Takaichi have also shown friendly, besides also committing in serious issues like security or trade or energy amid the Middle East war, they are also in this environment that it's very friendly in the sense that when President Lee was in Japan, they played the drums together. And then recently, Prime Minister Takaichi came to the hometown of Lee Jae Myung, which was pretty significant or symbolic in a sense, considering that Takaichi has this revisionist perspective on history that made many of South Korea distrust her when he took power. But so far, the Japan side and his side, through what he calls the pragmatic diplomacy, seems to bear fruits.
Right, and staying on the diplomatic front, Celio, during the press conference, you managed to ask President Lee Jae Myung about his stance on Israel. Could you give us some context behind your question and his response, of course?
Right, so for a couple of weeks now, we have seen more comment from Lee Jae Myung on the situation in the Middle East and especially on Israel. Korea's official position since the start of the conflict in the Middle East was quite distant at first, but everything started by a tweet from Lee Jae Myung reposting a video that of what he described as a war crime by Israeli soldiers, and he strongly criticized the Israeli government action in the Middle East since 2023. And then, a couple of weeks after, when two Korean nationals were arrested on their way to the Gaza Strip on board of a humanitarian flotilla, he described Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, as a war criminal, someone that kidnaps a foreign national, that is not respecting international law, and even mentioning briefly to consider a potential arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu if he set foot on Korea. So that were quite strong comment from the president, and also quite unexpected comments. And more recently in Korea, we have seen an increase of protests against the war waged by Israel, especially even targeting some Korean companies that are collaborating with the Israeli government. Protesters were denouncing Hanwha, a big conglomerate working in defense industry, for example, for its partnership with Israeli companies like Elbit System or Israel Aerospace Industry. Partnerships that were made before all the war started in 2021. But still, Korean protesters and activists are denouncing those partnerships. So my question was to know a bit more what's the personal also stance of Lee Jae Myung, because he was tweeting on his personal account, so maybe he has something to say personally about it. His answer was pretty much formal. He was not answering so personally. As he said, it's a very sensitive issue, and that can raise spur a lot of debate, hot debate in the country and abroad. And there was already quite a lot from different sides of the political spectrum about his comment on Twitter, on X. His answer, he reaffirmed that any country should abide by international law and should respect international law, and that seems to be the official position of Korea regarding Israeli government.
Right. Moving forward then, Ruy, among the tasks ahead for the Lee Jae Myung administration that you touched upon earlier, which do you suppose is the most important as we speak?
Well, right, a very complex question. I would say that in the local front, I will leave it a little bit more for the local media, but I will offer you the international press perspective on what we feel is the most pending tasks for Lee Jae Myung administrations, which are Middle East crisis and the energy security, a complex trade and military relationship with the U.S., as I mentioned before, and of course the fact that North Korea is still refusing dialogue. So some of these tasks are, for example, he even mentioned it in the press conference today. In his belief, the Middle East conflict will not be solved in the near future. This is, I mean, I would guess it was not as quoted as I expected in the media, but I think it was a very important statement, because this statement happened almost very few days than U.S. President Donald Trump said that by the 10th of June they were going to get to a peace agreement. But at least now we know that from South Korea perspective, they at least not making plans that this conflict will solve anytime soon, considering that 70% of the energy imports of South Korea come from the Middle East and the 95% passes through the Strait of Hormuz. This is a big deal. President Lee Jae Myung did say that in the press conference today that he didn't believe the country was going to go to a crisis, mentioning that right now they have covered 87% of supply, normally energy supply, and this shortage of 10% that they have right now, he said it can be overcome with export controls. So yes, he brought some calm, let's say, to citizens in that sense, but in let's say, thinking a little bit more about long term, still, if this conflict lasts more like years, it extends to years, a couple of years, 1 year, we're still not sure if South Korea is going to be able to get all those energy supplies that they need. But at least, let's say, for this year, maybe, it seems that they have handled it pretty well, but that's a big challenge. And of course, nobody really knows when this is going to end. The complex trade and military relationship, as I mentioned, things related to tariffs. In the military side, the fact of there had been certain discrepancies related to the OPCON transfer, the operational control of the military from US to South Korea. President Lee Jae Myung, of course, one of his main objectives is to get it done before the end of his term. It seems to be sometimes also the objective from US, but sometimes they seem to have a different date than the South Korean. At least some reports in the media point out that. Also, the fact that Trump has mentioned many times that he's maybe gonna cut the number of troops in South Korea. So those kind of issues, I would say the challenge is to somehow make it or clarify what's gonna be the relationship with the U.S. forces in Korea or with the U.S. government in this regard, because right now there's a lot of doubt. Lastly, but not least, the North Korean dialogue. And this is a little bit related to the fact of the pragmatic diplomacy that I was talking about. Maybe North Korea is not that mentioned in that part of pragmatic diplomacy, meaning that you kind of give in a little bit on the ideological sense and you try to get deals that benefit the country at the moment. With North Korea, if we stretch it a little bit, we can see the sunshine policy, the famous sunshine policy that they apply to North Korea could be a little bit in the pragmatic sense, because you need to understand the problem, what they call realistically, and say we cannot demand North Korea to denuclearize tomorrow. First, we need to stop their advancements in weapons, or they keep increasing their nuclear power, etc., etc. So the fact that they apply this policy, I would say, compared to other countries, it still hasn't worked. For North Korea specifically, because they still refusing dialogue, they still have a strong language against South Korea, and of course, if we have time to speak later, the issue of denuclearization is clearly off the tables for Pyongyang. So it will be a challenge to see really how they're gonna get, if they get, the first exchange with North Korea. And yeah, once they get it, maybe the conversation will change a little bit.
Right. Celio, beyond your question on Israel, the domestic media, President Lee Jae Myung fielded quite a number of questions from the domestic media. What appears to be the interest of the media here in South Korea, do you think?
Well, mostly for local media, I would say the focus is on economics and livelihood. The journalists ask about the rising prices, especially as we mentioned with the war in the Middle East, with the Strait of Hormuz being blocked. All the prices have seen inflation and prices are rising, and we are preparing for what could be a long-lasting inflation if the conflict doesn't come to an end. President Lee said his priority for the next year is to ensure a stable livelihood for Korean people, allowing people to live without having too much to worry about their money, being only focusing on work and not too much on the rest of their life. He announced his intention to increase a social financial mattress for the people that would need it. And the other pressing issue, as I touched a bit on that at the beginning, is the real estate. And there was an important question about that. Lee Jae Myung already, as I said, worked a bit on reform on the housing market the past year, but the price of buying or even renting a home in Seoul is a huge issue that needs a lot of work, of course. Last year, he pushed for incentive to reallocate the assets that are stuck, according to him, in the housing market back to the stock market to make the economy more running. Because for him, all this money that Korean families are spending and saving for the housing market is distorting the Korean economies, and he rather would like to see it in the stock market, making the economy run. And for that, he referred to the current situation in Korea, the housing market crisis, as a time-ticking bomb that will eventually explode at some point. And he mentioned that the consequence of that explosion would be very detrimental for Korea, and he referred to the case of Japan, which happened around 30 years ago, and still Japan is barely out of the crisis. It was a very long-lasting crisis, so he really wants to avoid that situation. So how to avoid it? Well, for him, the solution is to make people, make it more easier to access a home in Seoul. And for that, it's to increase the supply of home. Not necessarily by building more buildings, but by incentivizing people to maybe sell their secondary home. For that, he thinks the best way, the best leverage he has on people is through taxes, to have an increase of tax on holding multiple homes so that people would sell it. More house on the market means the rental price, the buying price will be lower, allowing more people to buy a house. We'll see how that plays out. It's very sensitive policy. It can have a lot of influence on the election, of popularity. So it really has to be made with a silk touch approach to not really brusque people and make it more trouble. But it's a critical issue.
Right. Ruy, I believe we have time for one more question. I'd like to revisit the topic with regard to North Korea and its nuclear weapons, which you mentioned earlier. A Japanese journalist actually did get the opportunity to ask President Lee Jae Myung today about his stance on inter-Korean talks amid Chinese leader Xi Jinping's visit to North Korea today. What did the president say, and what were your takeaways?
Well, first of all, he said that the visit of President Xi Jinping is happening in the worst moment ever for inter-Korean relations. He didn't detail much on what he expected from the meeting, but he focused more on the state of the relations. Still, he insisted again that South Korea is all in for denuclearization. Of course, with his approach of doing it gradually, the first objective, as I mentioned, is to stop their advancement and expansion of their nuclear arsenal or ICBMs and other large weapons. Maybe I didn't explain well before, but what I meant with the Sunshine Policy comparison, of course, is not the policy of Lee Jae Myung, but he has mentioned it as an inspiration to these gradual steps that he will take to, in the long term, achieve denuclearization. What I meant by this is that in a way, it could enter this pragmatic way of seeing things by his administration. And he did reiterate today in the sense that right now you cannot ask Pyongyang to denuclearize right away. And first, you need to have these steps to then achieve it at some point. He even said it in that tone, like, at some point, like they don't have a clear date, but they know what they need to achieve first. One very interesting thing, I know we're running out of time, but I'll say it quickly, is that this statement of President Lee that saying that they're all in for denuclearization happened just hours after the Rodong Sinmun, the North Korean daily, published an op-ed by Xi Jinping where he talked about many things they will discuss today and tomorrow during his visit to North Korea. Denuclearization was not there, as many expected, of course. But if we take into account that in the recent meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, they agreed, well, the White House said that they agreed on denuclearization of the peninsula. Well, the statement, the fact that China is still avoiding this in these meetings is interesting, because could it mean, for example, that Kim Jong-un is kind of having the power to really condition these talks, to say, okay, nobody comes here. If we talk about denuclearization, I cannot talk with US, or I cannot talk even with China. So it's an interesting point, I think.
Right, and I suppose we'll know for sure once the talks take place between Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Ruy, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you, Simon.
Celio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, that ends Press Perspective for today. As always, thank you for watching.